Today we're going to talk about thesis statements, and I know that all of you have, at some point, been introduced to the concept of the thesis statement, but one of the goals for this class is to work on creating stronger and meatier thesis statements, especially as the semester progresses. So we're going to begin this lecture with, as I said, a brief introduction to thesis statements. The definition for a thesis statement is that it is a statement or theory that is put forward as a premise to be maintained or proved. As you all know, the thesis statement should be at the end of your introduction paragraph, and your thesis statement should be so clear that all I have to do is read that one sentence or possibly two sentences if you have a two-sentence thesis statement, and I should know what your essay is about. If you read that last sentence in your intro paragraph and you think, I don't think my reader knows my argument, then that's the first indication that you need to do something to revise your thesis. And so that's one of the reasons why I like to have this little signpost here. The thesis statement is like a signpost. It is showing your reader the direction that they need to head. It's telling them where they're going to go. Another analogy for the thesis statement is that it's like an umbrella. It covers all the main points in your body paragraphs. And so that's another thing to think about as well, that the thesis should be broad enough to cover everything, but also specific enough that, again, your reader can read that one or two sentence and know what your essay is about. As a side note, a couple of years ago, my mom was talking about business with me and my other family members, and I don't really have a good head for business. And so at one point, and she was just inundating me with all this information, and I finally said to her, Mom, you don't have a thesis statement. And so she said, okay. And a week later, I went back and she said, I have a thesis statement for you. And to be honest, she gave me the thesis statement and all that information suddenly made sense. Again, the thesis is the point of your essay. It should be really clear to your reader. Another component to the thesis statement is that the thesis statement should always demand further proof. So you shouldn't present an idea that's so simple that we don't need to read anything else about what you're arguing. What do you think of this statement? On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. So my first question is this really a thesis statement? My answer to you is no. There's nothing that needs to be proven based on that statement. It's a fact. The only people who would consider it possibly an argument, and again, it's not an argument-driven statement, but the only people who might possibly consider it to be an argument would be those who don't believe in the lunar landing, and then you're going to have to do a lot more to convince them. So you would still have to revise the thesis statement. What do you think of this statement? When Neil Armstrong first walked on the moon in 1969, many people perceived this act as a symbolic defeat of the USSR in the Cold War. This is a statement that does require further proof. You need to explain why and how it was considered a symbolic defeat. What was going on historically? What were the Russians doing? I guess we'll call them the Russians. So what are the differences between these two statements? They have the same topic, but one is a fact while the other is an opinion. One is something that can't or doesn't need further proof, while the other one invites further proof. So again, for your thesis statement, you want to think of it as topic plus opinion equals thesis statement. Here are some general rules in relation to writing thesis statements. Your thesis should not be a question. It should be the answer to the question. If I'm giving you an essay question, it should be an answer to that essay question. So you want to make sure you are directly responding to that question when you write your thesis statement. A thesis should not be a title. A thesis should not be a fact. A thesis should not be a simple list of your main points. I've already discussed this and I will probably discuss it again, but when you have a thesis statement that just laundry lists your main points, you're not really doing much with it. It's not an umbrella. You have a thesis statement made up of spokes of an umbrella. The other thing, though, is that a thesis statement should not be a direct quote. If you're using a direct quote for your thesis statement, you're basically saying to me that you do not have an argument, that you had to research somebody else's argument and you're just borrowing their words. You want to have an argument or idea or thesis statement that is truly yours. The final thing and most important rule that I will give about thesis statements is that a thesis should be an opinion-driven statement that requires further proof. That's probably the best and most succinct way of describing or explaining what a thesis statement should be. Opinion-driven, requires further proof. In addition to the general rules, I do have some points on how you can create a better thesis statement.
One, if your thesis is too simple or too general, you will have trouble developing your essay. So here's an example of a simple thesis. There are serious objections to today's horror movies. While I think the topic has potential, because there isn't really an argument here and there isn't even an opinion here, it makes the thesis very dull. And the final component is that it's just a little bit too broad. And so the questions that I might ask are, where do we go from here? Do we even care? At this point, not really. But what if we contrasted it with this? Because modern cinematic techniques have allowed filmmakers to get more graphic, horror flicks have desensitized young American viewers to violence. Now, the thing that's great about this thesis statement is there's so much more that you can cover here than we had with the previous sentence. We can talk about the modern techniques that we have. We can talk about how filmmakers have become more graphic, and then why the young have become desensitized. And then we should probably address this clown because he's scary as well. I'm not a fan of clowns. I wish I could have seen it because it seemed really cool, but I actually hate horror films. Another general rule to think about is if your thesis is vague or unclear, your reader will not know your essay's intended purpose, or you'll not have given your reader enough of a reason to care. So here's another example of a really vague thesis with no opinion. There are advantages and disadvantages to using statistics. Even if you're a fan of statistics, I don't think you would want to read this essay because it's so generic. And it actually, as I said, advantages and disadvantages means you don't want to give an opinion. So why should we care? So here's a better thesis. In order to ensure accurate reporting, journalists must understand the real significance of the statistics they report. So we have a real argument here. Journalists must understand statistics, and we have a reason why, because it will make them more accurate in the reporting. And there's also a need, even though the need isn't necessarily stated here, and that's that we need to know that we can trust our journalists, especially in the particular political climate that we have now. I have a second better thesis statement on statistics, and again, because it's been narrowed, we have a completely different argument. Because advertisers consciously and unconsciously manipulate data, every consumer should learn how to evaluate statistical claims. So what is the argument? Consumers should learn how to evaluate statistics and statistical claims. Why? Because advertisers consciously and unconsciously manipulate data. And so there's so much to go, or so many places where the author could go in this essay. They can talk about how the data has been manipulated, how consumers have looked at the data, and how they could actually evaluate the data now that they've actually learned how to evaluate statistical claims. Another general thesis, we must save the whales. You could put that on a t-shirt. And I do think that as a rule of thumb, if you could put a thesis on a t-shirt, that's a good indication that your thesis is too short. So what would be a better thesis statement? Because again, there's not much you could do with an essay. It would be just this very general, non-interesting essay. What if you said, because our planet's health may depend upon biological diversity, we must ensure that the whales are better protected? Again, a much more interesting argument. We have so much more that we can talk about just in terms of biological diversity and how the whale contributes to biological diversity, which again, in turn, contributes to the health of the planet, which then I think reinforces why it's so important to protect the whales. The third piece of advice that I give is that your position on the topic should be clearly presented in the thesis. And what I said here is note, this does not mean writing I think or my opinion. The fact that you're writing the thesis means that it is your opinion, or should mean that it's your opinion. You do not need to remind the writer that the opinion is yours. Just go ahead and jump into the argument. So here's a weak thesis. In this paper, I will discuss the relationship between fairy tales and early childhood. So we've got a couple of problems here. One is that the author's referencing the paper. You do not need to reference the paper. You can just, the fact that you're writing the essay and that the paper is in front of the reader is enough. You don't have to clarify that. And I will discuss. And again, there's not much going on here. It seems very broad and uninteresting. But what do you think about this thesis? Not just empty stories for kids, fairy tales shed light on the psychology of young children. Suddenly, we've got a much narrower focus and a much more interesting focus. My final thoughts on thesis statements are that a well-crafted thesis statement reflects well-crafted ideas. ideas. It signals a writer who has intelligence, commitment, and enthusiasm. If you look at the student learning outcome for English 1A, and we have a similar one for English 1B, one of our outcomes is that students write strong thesis statements. And the biggest reason for that is because, as I said, a strong thesis statement will always make your essay clearer and it will make your argument stronger. But it will also give you much more to explore than a weak thesis statement. I hope you're able to take some of this advice into consideration as you work on revising your thesis statements.